Can you hear me? Are you good? Yeah. Jill, can you hear me in the back? Well, welcome everyone to the first in our Solutions Seminar Series for this fall, which is sponsored by the newly named Institute for Sustainable Solutions. Some of you may know it by its former name of the Center for Sustainable Processes and Practices. So we are now renaming it to something that's a little easier to remember and hopefully will motivate us toward finding solutions. I'm Bob Costanza. I'm the newly appointed director of the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, and welcome all to this first in the series. Very good speakers following on from me as well, and a few announcements before I forget them. However, there are some students signed up to take this seminar series for credit. If we could have all of you stay after and talk with Beth over here, if you can raise your hand, Beth Lloyd. And we want you to stay after a little bit to discuss what we're going to do for credit for you as part of the series. I also want to say that this series is being co-sponsored by the Illahee Foundation, and we will continue that co-sponsorship through the winter semester and through or trimester and through the next spring as well. So we're hoping to focus attention here on how we build a sustainable and desirable future. I think that's the agenda for all of us. We have I think some real challenges facing us as a species, but also some real opportunities and some real important choices to make. And hopefully we can make a difference and make those choices more accurate or more beneficially to all of us. I also want to mention that in addition to the Institute for Sustainable Solutions, we're also bringing here from the University of Vermont this new journal that we just started called Solutions for a Sustainable and Desirable Future. We're into our 5th issue right now. I'm going to pass these around, but only if you promise that we get them back at the end. Everybody promise? Okay. And again, we're trying to use that publication as a venue for having this broader discussion about what are real integrative solutions for creating this desirable future. We're hoping that you all will participate in this activity at various levels, both through the Institute here locally, subscribe to the journal. You can also get it for free online. All of the content is available for free online, so take a look there. And also think about contributing something to the journal. In fact, the students for the class, what we're going to have them do is to write short pieces that, if they're good enough, might be published in Solutions. So, what's so important about this time that we're living in now? I think we're living in a really, what's been called a no-analog world, even a new geologic era. We're not in the Holocene any longer. We're in what Paul Crutzen has called Anthropocene, where humans are having such an impact on the behavior of this ecological system that we call Earth that we have to rename it as a new geologic era. The problems that we face, but to also try to move forward and to try to solve some of those problems. How do we do that? Well, I think that practical problem solving involves integration of these 3 basic elements. And I'll talk a little bit, Jerry's talk about all 3 of them. First is how do we create an adequate vision both of how the world works, or scientific paradigm, understanding of this complex socio-ecological system, but also of how we would like the world to be. What's our positive vision for the future? I think that's an essential element to sort of achieve some sort of shared vision of what our goals are. Both of those things, I think, are changing rapidly. The whole idea of sustainability is not that old. It's in the second category, that we would like the world to be sustainable. But we'd also like what we're sustaining to be good, sustainable and desirable future. the tools and analytical techniques that we use, the implementation strategies, the institutions that we employ, all need to be then appropriate to that changing vision of how the world works and how we utilize it. For example, we're learning a lot more about the operation of complex systems, and that these systems often don't behave linearly. That as we push and change these systems, they reach tipping points and thresholds, and they can change quite dramatically over quite short distances in those controlled areas. So one of our goals and one of the solutions is to design institutions that keep us within a safe operating space, keep us away from those dangerous boundaries. For example, in a recent paper by Tim Linton et al., we've identified several potential tipping elements in the climate system. Most well known is the melting of the ice sheets. But there are several other potential tipping elements or thresholds which, if we pass, will change the climate quite dramatically and quite quickly, perhaps more quickly than we can adapt. Recently, I was involved with a large number of other people in a workshop led by Jordan Rockstrom to identify the safe operating space for the image. And we identified these 9 important variables, and the green circle in the middle here is what we define as the safe operating space. It's well away from any potential thresholds that we might know about. And you can see that 3 of those, climate change, biodiversity loss, and nitrogen cycle, are well outside already the safe operating space. We don't know how long we can stay outside those boundaries, outside the guardrails, if you will, before we start running into significant trouble. Others are still within the boundaries. Others are not really well known enough for us to define where we are with respect to the boundaries. But there's a growing recognition that this is a finite planet that we live on. Again, we're having major impact on it, and we don't any longer live in what has been called an empty world, empty of humans and their artifacts. We now live in a full world, one where we're having these significant impacts, and that changes a lot of things. It changes our vision of our place in the world. I think even the mainstream media is beginning to get the point about this. This is a quote from Thomas Friedman recently in the New York Times, where he recognizes that, what if this recession that we're still in is more than just another recession? What if it's telling us that this whole growth model that we've been relying on for the last 50 years is just unsustainable and both ecologically and economically, and we've really hit the wall? Are we getting outside the safe operating space? Of course, some people take a much more adaptionist view, and this is an actual ad from Diesel Clothes, and this is their global warming ready line of clothing. So, maybe it doesn't really matter. This is Manhattan in the background. As long as you're sort of well dressed and you have nice companions, this is not going to be such a big deal. Unfortunately, I think it may well be. I think it's also important to look back historically and in order to understand sustainability, we have to take a broader historical view and understand what has led to the development and sustainability or collapse of historical societies. So one project I'm involved with is called iHope, the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth. We're trying to integrate environmental history with human history and try to answer those kinds of questions. How have humans interacted with their environment over longer historical time periods? This graph plots on a log scale starting back at 100,000 years ago, 10,000, 1,000, 110, and present. Several variables, including the rise of all civilizations over here, various technologies over here. The red line is the temperature. And you can see human Homo sapiens as a species is maybe 250,000 years old. During this period of the Pleistocene, the temperature was quite erratic, going through ice ages and generations periods. It wasn't until the beginning of the Holocene, right here at about 10,000 years, that the climate really stabilized quite dramatically and at a quite warm and level. And this, in a sense, made possible the development of sedentary agricultural civilizations and civilization in general. And you can see the exponential growth of gross world product, human population, CO2, etc. There are some very interesting case studies within this when you start drilling down a bit. For example, the Roman Empire existed during a period of what was called the Roman climate optimum, when the climate in the Mediterranean was much warmer and wetter over a much larger period. And that period lasted just exactly during the period of the Roman Empire. So what was the relationship there between that climate stability and the ability of Rome to develop empire and its inability to maintain it? Several other things are going on here, but another important point is this start of the Great Acceleration, as it's been called, where at the end of World War II, things began to take off more than exponentially, faster than exponentially. You can see kinks in the curve right there at that point. And that's due to the rapid use of liquids and the rapid development of the fossil fuel, our fossil fuel civilization. You can see the impacts of that on climate as well as we begin to move off of the temperature record over the last tens of thousands of years. So the question, I think, and one of the questions that we have to ask, and what problems or challenges we have to solve, in this new full world context, in this different world that we now find ourselves, what really is the economy for? And the conventional view of the economy is something that we trade in the market, and the purpose of it is to increase the amount of stuff that we produce and consume in the market. And I would argue that in this new full world context, we need to take a broader view, that the economy really should be for the purpose of maintaining human well-being and the sustainability of that well-being. Do I need to talk into that? Speak into that one. Okay. How's that? Can you hear me on that one? No. Can you hear me now? Okay. So, human well-being and its sustainability really should be the purpose of the economy. And so everything that contributes to that well-being actually should be part of what we keep track of in our economic accounting. The conventional view, however, of the economy is quite limited. It looks something like this. There's firms and households, and their goods and services, and that households provide the labor input, and goods and services go back to the households. And so you can see there's nothing in this view that takes any consideration of natural resource inputs, of the waste outputs and sinks, of the fact that we live in a biophysically limited Earth system. So another way of looking at that model of the world, this empty world model that I think still drives a lot of our policy decisions, is that there's these three basic factors of production: land, labor, and capital. But you can see that land is kind of grayed out because there's the assumption of almost perfect substitutability between these factors. That if we run out of land or natural resources, we use more labor and capital. We produce goods and services measured by GNP or GDP, which are then either consumed or reinvested to make more capital so that we can produce more goods and services in the future. So the goal of this or the premises of this model of the economy are that more is always better. The more we consume, the better off we are. Well-being is a function largely of consumption. This economy can grow forever. The scale of the economy is not really an issue because there's nothing in this model that prevents it from growing forever. That poverty can best be solved with more growth. The bigger the pie, the more we can distribute it. And that nature is really a sideshow in this model because it can be substituted for, and that private property is the best way to manage the system because we're talking about goods and services which are largely rival and excludable and can be privatized. So you can get carried away with this approach as well. This is an actual ad that I found in an in-flight magazine for Alabama Power, and their motto is always on. So if you don't recognize it, this is the state of Alabama. And so they're saying, well, you know, with these low electricity prices, why not? Why not leave the lights on and all night and turn on many more of them and, you know, have it look like this? To give them a little bit of credit, this was back in 2005, and I looked at their website the other day just to see if they still had this attitude, and now it's completely different. Now they're talking about sustainability and all the energy efficiency and all of the right things. So progress is being made, I think, and some people are beginning to get the message that we need to shift to a more full world vision of the world, a full world model. Recognize that these four types of capital are all required. They cannot all be substituted for each other. And they're all required to produce both conventional goods and services and also more directly to contribute to human well-being. And human well-being is a much more complex function. It doesn't depend completely on the consumption of conventional marketed goods and services. There's lots of other things that contribute to human well-being, and that consumption only contributes up to a certain threshold. That the production process produce waste as byproducts, which have disamenity effects, that we live in a materially closed Earth system, and so there are limits to the size of this economic subsystem, at least the material size, within the larger ecological system. These four types of capital then are our built capital, our infrastructure, all of our buildings, roads, etc., the sort of conventional things we think about as capital, but it also includes human capital, our physical bodies, our individual health and education, and the information stored in people's brains. So this university and others are in the business of building human capital. There's also social capital. That's the web of the network of connections and rules and norms, and both formal and informal. All of our institutions are forms of social capital, extremely important contributor to our quality of life and our well-being. But usually left out of conventional economic models. And our natural capital is our land, our ecosystems, all of our natural resources, including the services that they provide. So we need, I think, a different approach to economics as well, one that is more ecological in its outlook, that takes into account the whole system and this the view that the fundamental goal is human well-being. You probably know that both ecology and economics come from the same Greek root, oikos, which means house. So ecology is literally the study of the house. Economics is the management of the house. We need to do those things in a more integrated way. There are also three interrelated and integrated questions or goals that this field is trying to address. The first being to establish and maintain an ecologically sustainable scale or magnitude or size of this economic subsystem, to establish and maintain a socially fair distribution of resources. This has a big impact on our social capital, and to have an efficient allocation of resources, recognizing that many of the things that enter into our benefits are outside the market system, and the market doesn't allocate those things efficiently. To do that, we need a true transdisciplinary dialogue, and I think that's one of the things that the Institute and some of the other things we're talking about is trying to establish and maintain. How do we get the broad range of academic disciplines that have something to say about this to work together, to focus on the problems rather than and their solutions rather than merely the tools, to build a more integrated approach to science that has a balance of synthesis and analysis. We spend a lot of time analyzing problems and breaking them down into their parts. We need to spend at least as much time putting the parts back together and trying to figure out what it all means. And we need more effective and adaptive institutions that can help us get there. So one important piece of this puzzle is what actually does constitute quality of life or human well-being. There's a lot of recent research in this area on what's now becoming known as the science of happiness. There are global surveys of subjective well-being where we ask people, how happy are you, and what are the things that contribute to that sense of well-being. And we know that the list of things that do contribute is fairly long. It's much more than simply subsistence and consumption, and it includes security and affection and understanding and participation and leisure and spirituality and creativity, etc. All the things on this list, weighted differently by different individuals and different cultures, but still all of those things are important to achieving a high quality of life. What we can do is provide the opportunities for people to meet those needs by how we arrange our assets, our built human, social, and natural capital, and how we use our time. So recognizing the relationship, I think, between all of those elements is important in understanding the way the system works, and also in helping to achieve our goals. This just shows some data along those lines, plotting GDP per capita on the x-axis against life satisfaction on the y-axis. And you can see that there's a range where increasing GDP per capita contributes quite a bit to increasing well-being. But beyond a certain point, it levels off, and consuming more is really not adding much more to life satisfaction. We could do with a lot less consumption in these countries. We could move back to this point and have almost as high, if not higher, life satisfaction and well-being, while consuming fewer resources and leaving more resources for some of these countries down there. How we measure our well-being, our economic performance, is usually using things like GNP or GDP. And it's important to recognize that that's a very poor measure of economic performance. It was never designed as a measure of economic welfare at all. It only really measures economic income or activity. So you can get some very strange results if you start thinking of GDP as the goal, which unfortunately it too often is. It only measures the value of marketed goods and services, and it includes things that may be considered costs rather than benefits. For example, if there's more crime, there's more police, there's more security devices, that leads to increases in GDP. There's more pollution. If there's an oil spill, someone has to clean it up. That leads to increases in GDP, not necessarily things that you would want more of. So there have been some attempts to try to measure something more approximating economic welfare by subtracting the costs and not confusing the cost and the benefits. But what we may want to do is move even further and talk about human needs assessment. Can we just go back to the basic human needs and see how well those needs are being met? The goal of the economy then would be to meet those needs with as little GDP as possible, not maximizing GDP or equating consumption with well-being. Just to give you an idea of how that works out, this is the ISEW Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, or it's been renamed the Genuine Progress Indicator. It includes these elements. It starts with personal consumption expenditures, which are a major component of GDP, but then it weights them by income distribution, because if you're talking about welfare instead of income, a dollar's worth of income to a rich person doesn't produce as much welfare as a dollar's worth of income to a poor person. You have that saturation curve. So you've got to take income distribution into account. It adds some things that are left out of GDP, but are nonetheless very valuable. The value of household labor and volunteer work. Then it subtracts a whole range of things that shouldn't be there in terms of well-being. The cost of crime, family breakdown, underemployment. This whole list of things in green are losses of natural capital, the cost of water and air and noise pollution, etc. When you apply that to different countries, you get results that look something like this. And you can see that the red line is the ISEW or GPI in some cases. The blue line is GDP. You can see that in many cases there's a very strong correlation up for a while. Let's look at the U.S. case, for example. But beyond a certain point, they start to diverge, where the costs of that additional growth really start to outweigh the benefits. If we focus on the U.S. case, this is the situation from 1950 till the mid-2000s. And you can see that for this period in the post-war period, GDP and material consumption was actually improving well-being. But beyond 1975, we've been in what you might call a quality of life recession ever since 1975, where those costs are outweighing the benefits. So we need to really take a hard look. And again, this is not the perfect indicator of human well-being, but certainly it's a better approximation to welfare than simply raw GDP. There's a lot of interest now, I think, in this issue and moving beyond GDP. Even the president of France, Sarkozy, has recently established a commission to look at alternatives to GDP. There's a large movement called the Gross National Happiness Movement that was started by the King of Bhutan, who said, no, we don't want gross national product, we want gross national happiness. And so I think there's a lot of interest now in creating alternatives to GDP. It's not as bad everywhere in the country as this graph indicates. Oops. For example, in Vermont, we studied the Genuine Progress Indicator for the state of Vermont, the county of Chittenden, and the town of Burlington, and showed that GPI was continuing to increase, even though the national average GPI was going down. And of course, Vermont pays much more attention to their social capital, to their natural capital. It would be interesting to see how this would work out for Oregon, for Portland, and for other parts of the country. And there are other studies going on. The state of Maryland has recently established GPI as one of their official state statistics. So there is some interest at the state level in taking these alternative measures much more seriously as a guide to policy and to solving the problem of improving the quality of life for their citizens and not merely their GDP. So the bottom line in all this is that this growth in material consumption that we've been pursuing so strenuously, it's not sustainable because of its impacts on our natural capital, on our climate system, etc. And it's also not necessarily desirable. It's not necessarily bringing additional happiness, at least not everywhere. So we need to take a much better look at that. The contributors to that also include social capital, as I mentioned. This is from an interesting book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone, where he created an index of social capital by state based on people's participation in voting and in social groups, in various kinds of institutions where they work together. You can see that there's quite a difference there in states' social capital. There's also another interesting recent book from Wilkinson and Pickett called The Spirit Level, where they look at the relationship across countries between income inequality and this index of health and social problems, and very strongly show that the worse the income, the more unequal the income distribution is, the worse this index of social problems is across countries and also across states. Not quite as strong a relationship, but still quite a strong relationship. So this very unequal income distributions has a negative effect on forming social capital, on people being able to work together. And so one solution to that problem is really to reduce that income inequality. The ecosystem services are the benefits that people derive from functioning ecosystems. We've been able to identify a long list of those services, from very global scale things like regulating the climate and supplying water, forming soil, cycling nutrients, etc., down to more local things like recreation and cultural amenities. And we've been able to estimate the total value of all of those services. Admittedly, very crudely and fairly conservatively, but even very conservatively estimated, the value of all of those services we estimated to be significantly larger than global GDP. So even all of those things that are included in the market are not as large in terms of supporting our well-being as the things that are excluded, our natural capital and our social capital. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did a more elaborate job of looking at this range of services and how they relate to the various constituents of human well-being. We also know that the loss or the conversion of our remaining intact ecosystems and natural capital leads to a net loss in the value of those services. This is again from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. We tried to estimate globally the benefit-cost ratio of preserving our natural capital using a scenario where we increase the reserve network to cover 15% of the terrestrial biosphere, 30% of the marine biosphere, and the cost of doing that, expanding that reserve network, was about $45 billion per year. But the benefits, which are the net value, the difference between the value of those systems in their intact state versus what they might be converted to, was on the order of $4 to $5 trillion a year. So a benefit-cost ratio of 100 to 1, a very good investment from society's point of view. There's a lot of activity and interest now in this idea of ecosystem services from the EPA, which has now formed a ecosystem services research program, to the USDA, which now has an Office of Ecosystem Services. There's an important new study just coming out, funded by the Deutsche Bank and the UN, called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, or TEEB. And there's a partnership being formed, a global partnership on ecosystem services to try and coordinate all of these activities. And importantly, here at Portland State, there's a new grant that Dave Irvin and others have just gotten, called an IGERT, an Integrative Graduate Education and Research Traineeship on ecosystem services for urbanizing regions. And this will be funding 25 PhD students over the next 5 years to study ecosystem services in those regions. So what do we do with all of this information? How does this represent, or how can this represent solutions to some of the problems to building a sustainable and desirable future? Well, I think one thing we can do is help change the market signals that guide a lot of behavior so that they're telling a better approximation to the truth. The current market signals that we're getting leave out all of these the contributions of natural capital, the ecosystem services, the social capital. So they're not really telling us a very good, a very accurate picture of what the true costs are of those activities. The answer, I think, is in general not to privatize those resources, because they are non-rival and non-excludable. They are best treated as public goods. But we need new kinds of institutions that can use that information to send the right signals. We could use full external cost and benefit accounting. How do we estimate those costs and benefits? There's a company that I'm involved with called TrueCost that tries to do that by company and use that information to rank companies in terms of their real external costs, not what they say they're doing, but what their actual impacts are on the environment. We could use ecological tax reform, so we could revise the tax system to tax bads, things like depletion of natural capital. Carbon taxes would fit in under that heading, and remove perverse subsidies that subsidize fossil fuel extraction, for example. On the plus side, we could use systems of payments for ecosystem services, as they do in Costa Rica now, where they collect fees from water users and ecotourist operations, and then pay farmers to replant forests and to preserve their existing forests. And they managed to reforest much of Costa Rica using that system. We could have impact fees for development that were actually tied to the impacts that we estimate on the natural and social and infrastructure capital, to give the right sort of incentives for developers to find ways to do things more sensitively. There's a lot of uncertainty always in what those impacts are going to be, and we could employ systems of environmental assurance bonds to incorporate that uncertainty to shift the burden of proof from the public to the parties that stand to gain from that activity. There's an article in the current issue of Solutions on using that kind of system for dealing with offshore oil drilling and trying to prevent disasters like the recent Deepwater Horizon disaster. And in general, we can expand the common sector of the economy. You can think of the economy as not just the private sector and the state sector, but there's another sector that we need to include, the common sector. And Peter Barnes, in his recent book, and he'll be one of the speakers in our upcoming seminar series, has a book called Capitalism 3.0, which he argues we need a new operating system for capitalism. Version 2.0 is about to crash the system, and we need to upgrade to the new version fairly quickly. Hopefully it'll be much better than Vista, but so I think the new version should be a Mac-oriented operating system. But Capitalism 3.0. What does that mean? Well, it means expanding the commons sector of the economy. How do we do that? Well, we can do that at several different scales and several different kinds of institutions. I think this is an area where we need some real creative thought about the kinds of institutions that might best serve the commons sector of the economy. Not to the exclusion of the private sector or the state sector, but as a complement to deal with the kinds of resources that are not really well covered in Capitalism 2.0. At the local level, things like land trusts fit into that category. More regional things like watershed trusts, and all the way up to the global level, we might think of an atmospheric or an ocean trust. We know that to solve the climate problem, to get back to 450 or even 350 parts per million, we have to get onto a emissions trajectory that's even steeper than this one. This is the trajectory for 450 parts per million. So we need an even steeper decline in carbon emissions. How are we going to get there? People have suggested various methods. One idea is to think of the atmosphere as a community asset that should be held in trust for current and future generations, and that we have a lot of experience with trusts and trusteeships in terms of managing assets. Let's expand that legal mechanism up to this much larger scale. It could include a cap and auction and dividend and trade system, and I think these are important elements, not just cap and trade, but we have to auction off all of the permits and pay some of the revenues from those permits back to people in general, everyone on Earth, as a dividend, and use the remainder of the revenues to directly enhance and restore and rebuild the asset. So this would be one mechanism, one institutional mechanism that might both deal with the global warming problem and also reduce poverty and reduce the gap in income, both inside countries and between countries. I like this cartoon, and the guy saying, it's now 2060, and we're still looking for the breakthrough technology to solve climate change, and finally we're working on a time machine that will let us go back and put a price on carbon when we should have done it, 50 years ago. And this guy down here saying, we better hurry with this, and he's saying, no, we don't need to. That's the beauty of this technology. We can always go back. Anyway, I think an important part of this challenge also, or maybe our most important challenge, is to create and communicate a positive shared vision of what this future would look like. We seem to be headed in a bad direction. People are not really perceiving a choice there, though. It's like we have to deal with whatever comes. But I think there is a real choice. But in order to have that choice, we need to create the alternatives. This is from a paper by Dana Meadows talking about the whole process of envisioning, which is an important problem-solving exercise. Many complex problems, like I said at the beginning, require first having an adequate vision of what we're trying to achieve. What's the kind of world that we really want, as opposed to the kind of world that we will settle for. And she lists things in both of those categories. We want permanent prosperity, sustainable well-being. We don't want unsustainable growth. We want human happiness. We don't necessarily want GDP, although that's a contributor to human happiness, but it's not happiness itself. We want health. We don't necessarily, and medicine may contribute to that, but that's not the same as health, etc. And I think it's also really critical that these visions be shared and be developed, as a community. I think the essence of democracy really should be about creating the shared vision of the kind of a future that we want. I should mention at this point that on November 6th, we are going to have a campus and community-wide envisioning event. The location is still to be determined, but that's a Saturday. It'll be from 9 to 2 in the morning, and we're hoping that you can all sort of participate in that. We're going to ask the question, how would we like the university to look? Take this process seriously. Forget about where we are now or how we're going to get there. How would we like the system to look at some point in the future? And use that as the basis for devising policies to help us get there. There's a lot of other initiatives along these lines. We did an exercise for the U.S. not too long ago. There's an ongoing initiative called the Great Transition Initiative. You can look at this website where they talk about 4 possible future scenarios that may arise and what our real choices are. And this paper describes the process that we did at the University of Vermont, and we'll probably be replicating something like that here at PSU, starting on the 6th, but making it more of an ongoing activity, not necessarily a one-off thing. This whole idea of scenario analysis, I think, has been extremely important and influential in thinking about the future and what alternative futures might be. And in many cases, they look at for some reason, it ends up being 4 alternative futures, and what those imply. Going back to a really important exercise right after apartheid in South Africa, at a retreat center called Mount Fleur, where that process, I think, allowed them to, and they brought together people from the entire political spectrum that had never talked to each other before, and said, what are the possibilities for this country going forward? And they could be the white government sticks their head in the sand and things remain bad. It could be that the new black majority sort of tries to change things overnight and gets too close to the sun. Or it could be that the flight of the flamingos, they call it, where they all sort of rise together. And that motivated, I think, a lot of the positive changes in South Africa that allowed them to make that transition relatively smoothly. Likewise, there have been several other exercises, including the Millennium Assessment, this Great Transition Initiative I talked about in the country of New Zealand has done this recently. We've done some work on the future of agriculture in Iowa and the future of the Great Barrier Reef. So this kind of exercise, I think, is something that we could also engage in here at various scales, both within the Portland area, but also for the state, for the country as a whole. The broader challenge I think we face is to change our worldviews, our visions of how the world works and what our goals are, and our institutions and our technologies in a much more integrated way towards this positive vision of the future. I know that this one's maybe a little bit hard to read, but this is a summary slide of the things I've been talking about. We need to move from our current model of development in the world, what's been called the Washington Consensus, to this more sustainable development model. The current model thinks of the primary goal as more, increasing GDP. We need to refocus on better. How do we improve quality and not just quantity? We need to shift our primary measures of progress from things like GDP to things like GPI. We need to make sure that scale or carrying capacity or planetary boundaries are a primary concern. In a conventional model, that's not even an issue because there's an assumption that we can always overcome any of those boundaries. We need to focus on distribution and poverty as also a primary concern and not just something we give lip service to. The conventional model, assumes that a rising tide lifts all boats, but what we found is that a rising tide only lifts all yachts. And the rest of the boats we need to do something about as well. We need to worry about economic efficiency and allocation, but we need to bring in everything that contributes to that, and we can't rely on the current market signals to do that. We need to look beyond the market to things that are natural and social capital assets and how we bring them into the allocation mechanism. We need a much more elaborate view of property rights, one that acknowledges that there is a major role for our common property assets as well as our private and our state property assets. We need I think a new roles for government. Not in the conventional model, government is to be minimized and where possible replaced with market institutions. I think government needs to have a central role, but maybe a different role as new functions as a referee, facilitator, broker in this new suite of common asset institutions. And we need a new set of principles for governments, more than just laissez-faire market capitalism. We might need a set of principles like these that include things like the responsibility principle, that the right to use common asset resources carries the attendant responsibility to use them sustainably, that we need to match the scale of the institutions that were managing these resources with the scale of the resources themselves. We need the precautionary principle that we need to shift the burden of proof away from the public and towards the party that stands to gain from the activity. We need to recognize that anything we do to the system is an experiment, and we need to learn from those experiments and pursue more adaptive management. We need to assess and allocate the full cost and the true cost of all of our activities, and we need much broader participation in any sorts of policies as early in the process as possible. So here's another cartoon I like. And the guy here in the back, this is the climate skeptic in the back saying, yeah, but what if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? Well, yes, we do need... I think we can live with that. And so even if it is a big hoax, let's just go ahead and create a better world. I think that's our challenge, and that's our opportunity. To get to this new world, I'm not sure what exactly to call it, this sustainable quality of life economy, this the economy for the third millennium that's coming up. Lagom is a Swedish word that means everybody has enough. I'm not sure what to call it, but I think it requires these elements of a wide-scale conversion of our built capital infrastructure. So all of the things we're talking about with the shift to renewable energy and high-efficiency smart power grids and effective mass transit and high-efficiency buildings and cars, et cetera, all of those things need to happen rapidly. But we also need better and full utilization of our human capital that focuses on fulfilling work and full employment and access to education and healthcare and limiting population. We need to rebuild our social capital, reducing the gap in income and wealth. I think there's a path toward that, but we need to also reward community involvement and participation at multiple levels, and allow more time for people to connect to friends and family and community. And we need to restore our natural capital assets, focusing on protecting not just the climate, but all of our natural capital and ecosystem services. There's a couple of interesting new books that have come out along those lines, one by Peter Victor in Canada called Managing Without Growth, and another by Tim Jackson in the UK called Prosperity Without Growth. They both ask this question: do we really need economic growth in the conventional sense to achieve prosperity and well-being? And the answer in both cases is no, we don't. We can achieve, and Peter Victor's book is a macroeconomic simulation model where he asked that question, a fairly conventional one, and he projects into the future. We can certainly have a system that's not growing that's a disaster, he finds, but we can have a system that's not growing that provides high levels of employment, low levels of carbon emissions, high quality of life, but does not necessarily need growth in GDP. Likewise for Tim Jackson's book. The policies to achieve that, I think, are many of the things that we've been talking about. This just came out the other day that in Denmark, they're talking about how to get to a fossil fuel-free Denmark by the year 2050. And I think they're adopting that as a national policy. So what are these solutions then? I'm not claiming that what I've been talking about are the answers. What I'm talking about are the invitation to start thinking about how we can create a vision of this positive future and how we might think about getting there. That's going to take, I think, though, participation from all of us. We created this journal in order to have a venue for that discussion because we thought that venue really wasn't out there. Our rule of thumb is that no more than a third of the articles can be about the problem, and 2/3 have to be about the solution. That it's a hybrid academic, peer-reviewed journal and popular magazine, so we're trying to bridge across all the various academic disciplines, but also between academia and the policy community and the general public, and focus on dialogue rather than debate. And you can see that we have a quite good editorial board and set of associate editors. Ida Kubashevsky over here is the managing editor. Raise your hand, Ida. So if you have any problems with the journal, it's she's the one. But right. And if you have any ideas for articles for the journal, certainly let us know. So we're open to input from many places. There's a website I said that is open access and that has much more than we can afford to print. So there are several groups that you can participate there on the website and other sorts of things that are included in the website. So just to conclude, then, what are the long-term solutions then to flourishing on this biophysically limited planet that we have? My opinion is that I think we need to break our addictions, and I think one of the problems is to recognize that we are addicted, even as even George Bush admitted, to oil, but not just to oil, to overconsumption and to our particular worldview. And that breaking those addictions is not, like breaking any addiction, is not necessarily a simple thing. But we can do that by envisioning this more sustainable and desirable future, focusing on quality of life, on the positive side, on how we can create a better world together, and that recognizes the contribution of natural and social capital. And it's going to require a lot of changes, a new vision, new measures, new analysis, new institutions, new technologies. A lot of the things that I think it's extremely important that universities take the lead in providing. And I think this university is extremely well positioned to be the leader among those universities in making that transition. And it's also important to recognize and to communicate that this transition is not going to be a sacrifice of quality of life. It may be changing the way we do things, but it's really a sacrifice of quality of life not to make those changes. So thanks very much. And I think we have time for questions and answers. And I should also mention before everybody splits that next week we'll have Spencer Beebe from EcoTrust will be the speaker. I know that wasn't on some of the the announcements that went around, but Spencer will be here. And if you look on our website, you can see what the rest of the schedule is for coming weeks in the seminar series. So, questions? Do we need to pass the microphone around? Yeah? Okay. If I can get it out of here. Okay. We just have one mic, though?
Or I'll give you another mic.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I'm Anthony Sansoriello. I'm a system science PhD student here and very interested in sustainability. You mentioned, I think in November, bringing some people together in a venue to ask them what our shared vision of sustainability might look like, and referenced the Freedom Charter in South Africa and how that helped to maybe grease the gears in ending apartheid. And I wondered if maybe there was a way to hit all of the students at PSU, maybe like if we could perhaps organize some sort of an email with,
Oops.
Hello? Maybe an email that has some incentive for them, or it reaches out to people not just there at that forum, so that everybody can really try to, or we can really try to involve everybody in that shared vision, not just the people who are already invested and are going to want to attend that meeting already.
Yes. No, that's a very good point, and that is exactly what we're trying to do. So you don't have to attend the meeting in order to participate. There'll be other ways to do that, and that's the way we did it at Vermont, was to have a website you could go on and list your vision, or send us emails, and then we basically assemble all of that input and look for a sort of unique set of statements that people have made, because many people are going to be saying the same thing. So we sort of boil that down to a list of all of the things that people have mentioned, and then we send that back out to everyone as a survey and say, how important are each of these elements, and how would you prioritize them? And then we analyze that and feed that back. So it's kind of an ongoing process. And if you want to see how we did it at Vermont, there's a paper that describes all that. And
Okay, very cool.
but yeah, there will be the possibility for input from a broad cross section.
It will be on the ISS website probably tomorrow.
All right.
So, as will all other FOSS publications.
And I know for one, I'd be willing to lose some sleep over helping go through those emails for you if you need the hand. So
You got it. Fletcher, are you here? Okay, talk to Fletcher. He's going to be coordinating some of that stuff for us. Over there.
My name's David Guerin. I'm long ago PSU PhD graduate. Now I'm an adjunct in the geography department, and I'm a hydrologist by training, but actually I'm have a lot of interest in ecological economics. And my brother is actually a very conservative neoclassical economist. And
that must have been fun.
I can see a lot of things where there's sort of this ideological component. And I'm wondering, for example, his answer is the free market. Everything's private property in the free market. And it almost seems like an ideological thing connected to the idea of freedom. Free market is freedom, and that American idea of freedom. And I think, could you comment on how we might sort of address that kind of ideological, to me, stumbling point to get beyond, to be able to have the broader viewpoint that you talk about here, to get past this idea that free market equals freedom. How do we get past that?
Yeah. Well, I think part of the answer there is to recognize that not all goods and services fit into the categories that are well dealt with by free markets. There's a subset of goods and services, things that are rival and excludable. Rival meaning, if one person's use of the resource prevents other people from using it, and excludable meaning you can keep people from benefiting, until they've paid you. The market works very well for allocating those kinds of goods and services. And if those kinds of goods and services were all there was in the world, then that would be fine. The problem is there are lots of things that are non-rival and non-excludable, and those are the commons. And that's where the market doesn't work well. And it's sort of well known in economics that the free market does not allocate public goods very, very efficiently. So that's what we're talking about, and that's the common sector idea. So you might give him Peter Barnes' book to look at about capitalism 3.0. So it's not saying that we shouldn't have a market, and even within the market there can be free exchanges, but there are limits to what kinds of things we want to exchange in those kinds of markets, and I think we can identify where those limits can be based on the characteristics of the resources that you're trying to manage with that institution. And so moving forward, let's get the balance right. It's certainly also not appropriate to make everything into a community resource, into a common good. So we can't. Communism at one scale doesn't at one side of the spectrum doesn't work. Making everything community property, making everything private property also doesn't work. But there is an optimum, somewhere in the middle. And we don't have the freedom to do anything we want. And as the world fills up, we have more and more constraints. There's not this frontier out there any longer where it's really beneficial to or you sort of have a lot of freedom because you're not impacting anybody else. Now there's a lot of everybody else is out there, and so you can't expect to be able to do anything you want. And certainly, there are lots of restrictions on people's behavior. But I think the answer is leave as much freedom as we can, but in the appropriate context and within the appropriate boundaries. That's this safe operating space idea as well. Let's create the guardrails, and then you can do what you want within the guardrails as long as you stay within those constraints. We don't want to limit innovation, entrepreneurship, et cetera, but we want to guide it and direct it in a direction that does actually improve the public good.
I just kind of want to comment on that, give my opinion on that. The free market doesn't actually exist. If we accounted for externalities and included that in the way we currently do economics, then we would be paying much greater prices than we currently are for most goods. So the people that are pushing for the free market are pushing their externalities out onto us. And there's not enough information given for consumers to make adequate choices. A free market would entail putting on every label, we paid 10-year-olds $2 an hour to create this in Guam, and it doesn't happen in Guam. And it would cost this much to ship it overseas, and this is the amount of CO2 that was put out into the air. If that was on every label and consumers could make really educated choices, then maybe we'd have a free market, but we don't.
Well, that's a good point, too, that the same people who are for the free market are opposed to putting a tax or putting a price on carbon. And putting a price on carbon would actually improve the market's performance overall, because that would internalize that externality. So you can't expect the market to efficiently allocate resources if there are these huge externalities out there. So if you're really a free marketeer, you would say internalize all those externalities so the market can work. But for some reason, the people who want the free market don't want to internalize externalities. I can't figure it out. Over here.
I guess. Just quick answer. I assume it's because they want someone else to pay the price.
Exactly.
Right? So.
Who are you?
I'm Lee Medavoy. I run the Humanities Center on campus. The question I had for you had to do with your very last comment about this push for a GDP-driven economy representing a kind of form of addiction. And the reason that mattered to me was because it seemed to me up until that point, everything seemed very much a kind of like a problem of rationally rethinking our process. In other words, that what we needed to do was account for real human needs, make the truth transparent, and once people could see that, they would make the obvious right decisions. But what's interesting about addiction is that it doesn't really work like that, right? You can tell someone who's addicted that their life will be much better if they just stop this thing that they're doing. Right. And you can point to them all the ways that it will make things better and all the kind of truth about their lives that it will allow them to sort of, kind of use in order to exercise better judgment. But they still don't do it. And presumably, the real reason for that, setting aside a chemical sort of account, is that an addiction may not help you to succeed in having a better life or in achieving desirability, but it does seem to succeed at something, because otherwise they wouldn't give it up so easily. And so I'm wondering if really that's the crux of the real question when you're trying to talk to, say, the classical neoliberal economist about, this kind of position is, what is it actually that they're succeeding at in refusing these kinds of truths, and how do we address that problem? And that seems to me to be a much harder question. It seems to be a cultural question, an ideological question, a question of something that's almost psychic or psychological in nature that we kind of keep butting up our heads against. Otherwise, we would have solved the climate change problem. We would be doing something about it. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. No, I think that's, to me, the crux of the issue about why we haven't made the changes that we sort of obviously need to make. And I think this analogy with addiction at the individual level is something that we maybe can learn something from and apply and scale up to the social level. And so I've been working with this psychologist Tim Kasser, who's done some work on the psychology of addiction and how one overcomes that, and this process called motivational interviewing, which seems to be an important way to sort of address some addiction issues. And how do you scale that up to the societal level? And what they've learned there is, you can't, if you just sort of confront the addict with all of the rational arguments for why it's terrible and why they should change and why, you immediately get a defensive reaction, which denies all of that stuff and says, no, I'm perfectly fine, this is good, you can, and I think you see that, on society's point of view with all of the way we're framing the environmental issues and the climate issues, you see that sort of defensive reaction. And so if we really want to change, of course there's the old, psychiatrist joke, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change. So how do we get the system to want to change? Through I think the path to that is to really lay out the positive paths, to honor the past and say all of that stuff that we've done up until now was perfectly legitimate and fine, and we were doing the right thing because that was the path to improved well-being in that period. But now things have changed, and now the path also has to change, and here's a vision of the future that will allow us to get there and sort of bring people along, bring society along in that more positive way. I'm not sure that's the right answer or the right analogy, but I think it helps me to understand why we haven't done more than we have, more quickly than we have. Of course, here in Portland, we must have a lot of rational people and not very many addicts. So.
I'm Greg Hill from the University of Portland. That's the one up farther north. So that strategy, I was thinking about Ostrom's paper in your journal about multi-scale approach, I think that's what she called it, to climate change. And like that strategy you just described, it seems like we're talking a lot about changing individuals. And when we start talking about achieving change at higher levels, we start running into entrenched interests. And at some point we need to talk about power and addressing these big power differentials that exist. So what's a strategy that addresses those larger scales and change in institutions?
Well, yeah, and like I said in one of the slides, we have to change all of those things sort of simultaneously, not just individual behavior, but institutions which moderate and sort of incentivize individual behavior. So you can't just change one thing. But I think those things are changing, and the culture is changing, maybe more rapidly than we think or imagine. This graph is from this book, Creatives, by Paul Ray, and been looking at worldviews over time. So they ask people a whole range of questions, and then they categorize people into these three basic worldviews: the modernists, the traditionalists, and the cultural creatives. Modernists are sort of the consumption-oriented, growth in GDP orientation. Traditionalists are the everything in the past was better. The cultural creatives, though, are the ones I think that are on board with the kind of worldview that we're talking about. And what was amazing to me was the number of cultural creatives in the country, which is now I think up to about 30% of the U.S. population. I don't think most people recognize that there's that many people thinking the way that we're thinking here, and that eventually some sort of tipping point will occur where there's enough of those, people with that kind of worldview that it will have a seemingly overnight kind of shift in political behavior and other things. I'm not sure we've reached the tipping point yet, and certainly there's no media mirror of that worldview. I mean, the worldview that's out there in the mainstream media is very much the modernist worldview and a little bit of the traditionalist worldview. But it just means things are changing. And I think these kinds of major cultural shifts and transformations, I think, occur this way a lot of the time. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. You don't really see it until all of a sudden there's a tipping point, and almost overnight, the whole world is different. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, I think happened in that way. Nobody was predicting, from the outside that anything would ever change, and then all of a sudden it was different. So I don't know. It gives one hope, and it also provides, I think, maybe a strategy that the faster we can educate, the population and sort of move people into this worldview, the faster we might achieve those kinds of goals.
So we're broadcasting this live online, and there's one question from someone online, so I'm just going to ask it. What are the approaches to population management as a key commons question?
Say it one more time. What are the approaches to...
What are the approaches to population management as the key commons question?
Right. I think global population is sort of scheduled to level off in the coming century. The question is at what level is it going to level off? And it's partly due to the demographic transition sort of filtering out into into developing countries. I think we could encourage that transition more quickly. And usually what's pointed to is improving education in developing countries, particularly among women, that would really lower fertility rates. So none of these are draconian measures, but things that would actually change the birth rates. But they could do that fairly quickly. So if our policy was really to achieve stable population as quickly as we could, I think we could move in that direction much more rapidly than we are now. But even if we do nothing, the projections are that population will stabilize. I think the most likely level is at about 9 billion. But 9 billion people is a lot of people. And if we have to spread around our limited resources among that many people, especially if we start doing it much more equitably, then it means lower levels of material consumption for everyone. And we may want to leave those levels at a higher level.
Hi, I'm Alec Kretchen, a first-year environmental management grad student here. I was just curious, you said that the place the government needs to move towards is more of as a refereeing and brokering role, and I was curious if there's anywhere else you felt was acting more as a model for that, like if there's any other nation you feel is acting more as a model for that type of behavior?
Well, the system of payment for ecosystem services in Costa Rica, for example, there's a quasi-government agency that they set up to broker that exchange. So again, that's a situation where you can't rely on the free market to do it, because the beneficiaries and the producers, are just too disconnected from each other. So you need some sort of quasi-government agency to come in and say, yes, these are valuable services, and here's how we can assess fees on one end and pay producers on the other end in order to provide those services. So I think that one works pretty well. This idea of trusts, common asset trusts, I think would be another example, where you need the government to set up the institution, and it may be a quasi-government or NGO kind of thing, but it needs to be somewhat independent once it's set up, but I think it could function as a whole, as a good kind of institution for achieving those goals.
My name is David Sweet. I'm a full-time volunteer, and so much of the work I do is in the commons sector. I don't see anybody who is anxious to pay me for what I'm doing. I wonder what full employment looks like in a steady-state economy.
What exactly are you doing? What kinds of things? Let's see. We can
I'm
figure out
involved
how
with
somebody
my
can
neighborhood
pay.
association, with my neighborhood coalition. I'm doing a community garden, a community orchard, a community solar project, farmers market.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine some ways that a sort of common sector institutions might find to pay you for some of those services. Yeah, if we set up the institutions properly. Do you need to be paid?
Where do the institutions get the money to pay people to do that kind of work? Where does that come from?
Well, in general, it's going to be whoever benefits from that activity and that has the resources. I mean, it's going to be very case specific, so we'd have to talk about particulars. But I think it might be possible to set up some, and I think that's part of the creativity that we need is to come up with some ideas about institutions that can be part of the commons and that can provide more full employment. One idea that comes to mind too is this idea of a local currency, of a complementary currency that we could establish, and that could be used to pay people in the local economy that are not competitive in the global economy. But if we want to stimulate local production, which I think we do, then let's create our own currency to handle that. So that might be the answer to your dilemma.
Hi, Eileen Brennan from School of Social Work and the Social Sustainability Network.
Hi.
I love the idea of the envisioning, but I wonder how you do envisioning when substantial numbers of people are excluded from the benefits of a good part of our society. So how do you overcome discrimination and other kinds of exclusionary practices when you're attempting to get a common vision?
Well, I think part of what we've managed to accomplish in this country is to overcome some of those kinds of exclusions of women, of blacks, for example. And how do we do it? We did it with, first of all, starting with the vision of equality, that there should be equal rights. So I think establishing the vision is maybe a first step in overcoming some of those problems. And part of it is getting the people who were excluded, to sort of help push the vision forward. So being as open and transparent as possible in generating that vision is important. So getting participation from those groups is one way to do it. Did you have something else in mind?
I was hoping you'd drill down a little bit farther. How do you get people from groups
Those
that have been excluded to participate in even starting the envisioning process? Because it seems that you would have to start at the grassroots level, working with individuals and building trust upwards.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's what you need to do. How to do it? I'm not sure I have a simple answer other than to try to make the process open and do the best you can. And if you have any better ideas or techniques, I'd be interested.
So here's a related question, also from online. Do you think it is necessary to have a unitary worldview globally? Sorry, it shifted.
A unitary, did you say?
Did I say that wrong? No, unitary worldview globally to achieve a more sustainable society. If so, do you have any ideas of what those unifying ideas might be?
Well, I think there'll be some unifying elements. And those unifying elements, I mean, you could think of the UN's Millennium Development Goals as fitting into that category. And so you could go online and take a look at those. That we should have, I forget exactly the list. There's sort of a long list of goals. But I think there's also going to be a lot of diversity in terms of how those goals get implemented, and that it doesn't mean that the entire world is going to look the same. In fact, quite the contrary. I think that we would have to recognize the unique bio, geophysical, and cultural characteristics of many parts of the world. And a sustainable future is probably going to involve more local production because we're not going to have the fossil fuels to ship things around all over the world as we do now. So at the same time, it's implementing a broader global vision of the goal of sustainable human well-being. It's also implementing that at the local scale in a much more diverse way than we are now, to take advantage of the local situations, both culturally and biogeophysically.
My name's Andy Iden. I'm a student in economics and environmental studies here, undergraduate. I was wondering, you mentioned global currency, but are you aware of the Berkshire phenomenon in Massachusetts, I think?
Yeah.
And is there anything like that in Vermont? And how applicable do you think it would be to Portland? Is it a larger city we have here that...
Yeah. You meant local currency rather than global currency,
yeah.
Right? Here's one we were doing in Vermont. And I'm familiar with the Berkshires and Ithaca Hours. We actually did a course on local currency at Vermont and tried to analyze. There are more than 4,000 of these local currencies around the world right now. And so we did a survey and found that they rarely, if ever, achieve sort of anything more than boutique status in their communities. Even Ithaca Hours, which has been around for a long time, doesn't represent a really significant part of the local economy. And so our question was, why not? And what would it take to overcome that barrier? And our conclusion was that you needed two things. You needed, first of all, a major institution in the community to be behind. So we were trying to get Burlington to be a backer of this. Hybrid of a paper currency and an electronic transfer. We never could get the city of Burlington to back the currency, and sort of faded out. But maybe things are different here in Portland, so it might be. Has anybody introduced a local currency in Portland? There are several. Are any of them sort of connected with a major institution, or is it all sort of Yeah. So I think that's what it would take, the city of Portland sort of getting on board, being a major issuer and backer, so that there was always some place for people to spend the currency. I think if you got that, it could make a real difference. It really could help with unemployment issues, because it gives people who are now volunteering a way to get something for their efforts, and they would be limited in terms of spending it back in the local community, but that would stimulate local food production and local activities that I think people also want to stimulate. So you can also think of it as a way for the city to issue sort of interest-free bonds. They could issue the currency, spend it on labor to build more bike paths, or whatever their community projects where that employs the local people. They spend that currency on local production, and you start a virtuous circle. But you've got to get a critical mass, to make it work. And without a big institution behind it, I don't think that, or at least in our survey, that never happened. Make sure I get that Burlington bread back. By the way, it's my last one.
My name is David Osborne. I'm an adjunct faculty member here. And I had a question that kind of connects to a couple of the threads.
Thanks.
I guess from my perspective, the entrenched interest and the powers that would challenge this movement are significant. And so I think in order to challenge those powers, we have to build power. And the emergence of this worldview, which I think is correct, is not sufficient. We also have to coordinate and organize this kind of emergent group of people that share this kind of different thinking about the direction we need to go. So I wonder what your thoughts on civic engagement and social movements and organizing are as part of enacting this vision.
Mm-hmm. I think that's going to be an essential component. Actually, Gus Speth, former dean of the Yale School of Forestry, now at the Vermont Law School, has an article in it's the latest issue of Solutions on just that topic. I think of how to get to a new economy and the sort of political and civic engagement that it's going to take, and sort of at least moderating, if not overthrowing the power of some of our current institutions like corporations. Whether that can be a smooth evolutionary transition or not, I think is a question. I'm hopeful that it could be, and there are some hopeful signs. Things like the B Corporation. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but a new corporate structure that actually encourages and allows social goods as being part of what the corporation is about. Other sorts of civic groups, at least at smaller scales, I think have been quite effective. Here in the city of Portland and at the state level, those sorts of movements have managed to change things. But there are some pretty big global special interests out there that are going to stand in the way of these kinds of changes and how to overcome that. Again, I go back to the addiction analogy. It's probably better even for those institutions to make these kind of changes. And I think you can make that case logically fairly clearly. But they're stuck in a positive feedback loop, in the short-term returns, and it's going to be difficult to make the changes. Do you have any ideas on how to do that? I want to hear a solution. Come on.
I just think that, it's my only comment would be to kind of place that as critical and to see the kind of change that we need to happening outside of a role as a consumer, which I think often is unfortunately kind of a direction that the change is taken. I don't think you've suggested that here this evening, but to see a more dynamic and deeper notion of civic engagement in terms of people taking a more active role in shaping their communities politically, socially, culturally, and otherwise. And so I just think that it can't be overemphasized, the importance of engaging in that type of civic activity and becoming part of hopefully more vibrant social movements.
I agree. How to do that, how to encourage people to become more engaged. Any ideas there?
Well, I think people getting involved in local issues is one good way to go. There's, for example, a large infrastructure bridge project, the Columbia River Crossing. I think that in some ways touching these local issues that touch the bigger issues, whether that in that case it's dealing with questions about livability, sprawl, climate change, air pollution, et cetera. I think that there's a cynicism that exists because people don't see their activity as making a difference. And so I would encourage people to in some ways get involved in local issues that touch the larger issues, because I think they can see a positive impact of their involvement and thus overcome some of that cynicism that exists in our society as regards civic engagement.
How about the envisioning approach? Do you think that's an effective way to get people engaged in at least thinking about some of the changes that need to be made, and then motivating them to get involved in making those changes? I know that's worked in some previous examples. So unless they see a common goal that we're all working towards, then it's hard to build a lot of momentum and interest. Okay, I think we're getting to the end here.
So students that are taking the course meet up front here after the course for a little while.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for coming. It was great. And I hope to see you again at the rest of the seminars. Huh?